A full and truthful accounting of America's racial history is vital to the education of our children.
And critical race theory isn't even taught in our public schools.
The American Religious Town Hall meeting is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here is your host and moderator.
Welcome, viewers. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Andrea Luxton, and I am the moderator for today's session. We have an excellent topic for the day, and I'd like us to start by interviewing or meeting our panelists.
Hi, I'm Tom Plumbley. I'm the senior minister at First Christian Church in Fort Worth, Texas. We're a part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Dan Levin. I serve as senior rabbi at Temple Bethel in Boca Raton, Florida.
Hi, I'm Carl Troval. I'm professor of ethics and history at Concordia University in Austin, Texas.
Hello, I'm Tony Matthews. I'm the senior pastor at North Garland Baptist Fellowship in Garland, Texas.
Thank you very much to our panelists. And now to our topic for the day. One of the current most hotly debated topics for American schools is whether critical race theory, or CRT, should be taught, or even if it is taught. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, a law professor at the UCLA School of Law and Columbia Law School, is often credited with coining the term in the mid-1970s. In an interview reported by the New York Times, she clarified that CRT is not one single world view, but in general is a way of looking at what facilitates racial inequality, how that has happened in history, and how that will continue without intentional systemic change. However, in the current discussion, those that consider CRT a risk, especially in schools, see the theory as a radical way of bringing diversiveness to society through exaggerating past inequalities and telling stories to children that will diminish white and national identity. Some will also argue CRT is intrinsically dangerous, based on atheistic ideologies and embedded in any texts that imply systemic racism or encourage anti-racism. Others, however, see this opposition as an attempt to stall positive attempts to face inequities that remain in society and put all attempts to face racism in a convenient bucket that can be dismissed because of its nefarious intent. So any story that challenges racism is automatically dismissed, and we teach our children to ignore important truths in our society. With all this in mind, the panel is asked to consider at least the following questions. How do you understand CRT and its risks and opportunities? Secondly, how can churches and synagogues encourage education of its children to create a more fair and just society? And thirdly, does CRT stand in opposition in any way to the precepts of the Bible, the Torah, or the Quran? I'm going to pass back to those that started our conversation today for the first word.
Thank you very much. This is a terribly important subject in all of our schools these days. In the area of the country that where I live and serve, it's a major metropolitan area. The Dallas-Fort Worth, or as we say in Fort Worth, the Fort Worth-Dallas Metroplex is one of the largest metropolitan areas in the country. And in this area alone, we have 5 major school districts who at the current time are looking for new superintendents. And the reason is that it's one of the major reasons is the flack that is getting thrown at schools from all sides about this issue and others like it. And I want to stand up in support of our public schools at all in all ways. Our teachers are getting battered and bitter, and they are belittled, and we have members of Congress who are attacking some of us among the clergy who are standing up for public schools. There was a letter sent to the Secretary of Education of the United States, Miguel Cordova, urging him. This letter was signed by the attorneys general of 20 states, okay? And it urged him to, saying that federal funding grants for public education include language that opposes, and these are words from the letter, deeply flawed and controversial CRT. And 25 of our states have either introduced or completely passed legislation banning the teaching of CRT. CRT has become a buzzword, a byword, even a curse word in the mouths of some folks that feeds a larger narrative that basically is an attack on our public schools. All in the name of, well, there is no critical race theory that is taught in our schools. What is taught is that America has had a race problem for 400 years. That's a simple truth. What is taught is that people were enslaved until about 150 years ago. That's a basic truth. The problem is that this has become a political issue that has reached into the depths of every one of our public schools in this country, and particularly in some of our red states.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I agree with what you had to say, and in fact, I want to emphasize, as I said at the very beginning, critical race theory is way too complicated to be even taught at the K through 12 school. It is a theory that originated in law schools, and even the originator of it, Kimberly Crenshaw, warned the name critical race theory is now used interchangeably for race scholarship, just like Kleenex is used for for tissues. In other words, it's become, tragically in our cultural language, it's just been a catch-all for for a whole group of people to oppose the discussion of race in our schools. I mean, the other problem is that even people in critical race theory don't even agree on the definitions of it. So I don't understand the bills that say you can't teach it, but even the people who teach it in law schools and in grad schools, which is usually where it's mostly taught, they don't even have a clear, it's a complicated topic that even they don't necessarily have a tight definition of it. And I think here's the other key piece is that critical race theory, as I understand it, is an attempt to ask the question why, after the Civil Rights Movement, which was a tremendous movement in our society, it advanced the rights of African Americans significantly, eliminated discrimination and prejudice in many, especially officially and legally, why is it that we still have a race problem even today, despite the gains of the Civil Rights Movement? And critical race theory is asking the question, in what ways are our laws designed and our structures in academia? How is academia designed on a macro level that actually, even though people intend to bring about equity and equality, the results have been disastrous? Because there's sometimes inherent structural issues that need to be addressed. And I oftentimes will compare this in class to capitalism. Capitalism is a theory. We use it. It has great dangers. It has great good. Critical race theory is just an attempt to analyze a problem and look at critically and say, what is it about this social practice that isn't working that we need to change so that we can get greater equity in our society? And the flip side is what are the dangers of it? Certainly there are going to be dangers to any theory, just like there. And then what do we have to do legally and socially to correct the problem? But I don't think kids in elementary school are by and large even addressing this problem. They just need to learn the history of the country. That would be a great start.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other panelists.
Yeah,
Tony.
very interesting topic. It is a lightning rod, certainly critical race theory. If it's not being taught in schools, it is certainly being talked about in schools, and that's something that we have to look at. It's very problematic. I think history should be taught. I think history is already taught. Slavery. The good, the bad, and the ugly of our country with slavery, with Jim Crow South. All those things are being taught, as I understand it. I think the problem with CRT, and actually it's critical race theory, CRT-I, with intersectionality. And I think it was Brother Tom that mentioned that it became a catch-all. So we have a lot of different things attached to CRT, and it has permeated throughout the schools. We've been inundated with black families who are opposed to anything being talked about or taught that will put their children in camps of I guess, saying that they are oppressed. And one of the challenges with CRT, if it's in theory or perception, is that people say that critical race theory will divide folks into camps of the oppressed and the oppressor. Blacks are the oppressed and whites are the oppressors, and that is being talked about across the country. That is the narrative that we hear. And I brought just a couple of quotes. There's a black lady that said, "I don't want my children to feel as if they are hopelessly oppressed victims. Black kids are turning against white people of all ages, and white kids are hating their parents and their success, their heritage, and calling their parents racist." The executive director for the Rocky Mountain Black Conservatives, Derek Wilburn, he says that he's not oppressed and he's not a victim. And so there's just a ton of quotes and comments from blacks. And then there are a group of blacks who will say CRT needs to be taught. And I think, I don't know if folks are embracing critical race theory itself, but just the whole ideal of the racial discrimination and the like. Those are things that are being talked about. It's a complicated topic, very complicated. But I think at the end of the day, for me, I don't think we need to teach any child in any school at any grade level that one group is oppressed and the other group is not, because we're all made in the image of God, and sin is not partial to any one group. We're all, susceptible to sin.
Thank you. Rabbi.
So I find this conversation fascinating because it is so multifaceted. Do we talk about what's happening in schools? Do we talk about how do we achieve better outcomes in terms of the idea of racial justice, and how do we do that? The purpose of law is to render holy outcomes, to create an ideal society, to render just outcomes. And so if the society is unjust after certain laws are being passed and implemented, then it's understandable that you might say, hey, you know what, maybe we need to look again at the law and see if the law is doing what it was intended to do. Mm-hmm. And I see in some ways that was what critical race theory was trying to address, was this idea that, well, we thought we could create a colorblind society. We thought if we just said we're no longer going to talk about race, then we can transcend the issues of race. Well, that didn't work. That hasn't happened.
Right.
I think about a few years ago in Center City, Philadelphia, there was a woman who was the manager of a Starbucks, and two young black men came into the restaurant to have a business meeting with somebody. And they were sitting there, and one of them went to use the restroom, and the manager said, well, you can't use the restroom unless you're a paying customer. Well, I can almost guarantee you, if I was in that restaurant in Center City, Philadelphia, no one would have said that to me. And then, eventually, the manager called the police on these young men. And so I think about what is going on in our society, in the structures of our society, all that contributed in that woman's 30-some-odd years of life to look at those two men and say, that's a threat. What did she see on television? What did she hear in her household? What was she taught in her church? What did she see in the movies? What happened to her when she was on the playground? Or whatever it was that she experienced that led her to construct in her mind this idea that those two men were a threat based on her outward perceptions of them. And I think we need to figure out how to deal with that. And I think that, as you suggested, Tony, so well, we need to try to figure out how we can help people to see beyond what is the facade that is presented to us. And I think that what our traditions all teach is this idea that each of us is created, as you said, in the image of God. And how do we see the holiness in other people? And for some people, the way to do that is to actually name their lived experience as someone who is black, or who is an Asian, or who is a South Asian, or who is Native, or because it is their lived experience. Brene Brown said beautifully that a narrative is data with a soul. And if we want to try to solve some of the problems that we see in our society, then we have to listen to the soul of the data that we're trying to address.
Excellent. Yes.
And our schools are wonderful places in which that kind of conversation takes place at age-appropriate levels, of course, for each grade. Those conversations are taking place. That's the way our children are being taught. That's the way our children are learning. People are not dividing. Well, you know, let me say it first, and then say, of course there are outliers. But generally, people are not dividing kids into oppressor groups and those who are oppressed, making kids feel worse about themselves for either of those reasons. That's not being done. And again, let me go back and say now, of course, somebody can raise their hand and say, well, my kid came home from school feeling bad about himself because of a conversation that was being had. Yes, there are so many millions of kids being educated. Yes, there are always somebody's going to get their feelings hurt about something. But we already have the mechanisms for correcting and dealing with those kinds of problems. For an entire state to be to have the sorts of legislation that we've had, we have now a group of teachers who don't know what they can say, who don't know what topics they can address, who don't know what to do to try to educate their kids in the best way that they think is possible. I trust in our teachers.
Thank you. Any other quick comment for the...
Well, only just in terms of awareness. You know, I was shocked when I learned my grandfather was a member of the KKK, and I thought, I'm from Minnesota. Well, who isn't a part of the KKK in Minnesota? And you know what? It has shifted my whole approach. I realize that I'm not personally responsible for what my grandfather did. He is. But at the same time it made me ask, well, what narratives have I been hearing in my family that maybe I need to think about more deeply that I need to change about myself, not because I'm an oppressor, but because I'm a human being who wants to make sure that when I love people, that I'm doing so honoring the fullness of who they are, and I'm not carrying some goofy anti-biblical narrative that maybe, okay.
Thank you. No, very good. But we must break now for a commercial. Let's have a break.
We hope you're enjoying today's program. If you'd like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the vision and history of the program, and we invite you to become a ministry partner, explore our Town Hall Estates healthcare facilities, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, we look forward to receiving your letters. You may write us at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. If you have a prayer request, please send it to prayerrequest@americanreligious.org. Thank you for writing and thank you for watching. Now, back to today's closing statements.
Welcome back. I feel as though we've only just begun this conversation. Very important, very diverse, and very rich in the content. I'm going to go back in a moment now to our panelists for them to give their final comments.
Thank you. There was a wonderful editorial cartoon in our local paper, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, the other day. It was titled, "Equal Justification Under the Law." And the cartoonist had drawn a long line of justices of the Supreme Court of the United States as if they were at trial behind the bench. And a plaque on the front of the bench reads, 94% white male justices, 1789 to 2022. And thought bubbles above each of the justices said things like, that wasn't a quota per se. And the next one says, no, coincidence. And the next one said, toss of a coin. The next one said, merit, of course. And the next one said, at least we don't own slaves anymore. And the next one said, that Dred Scott thing was a bit of an embarrassment. Now, there wasn't one thing in there about critical race theory, but it just tells you what the factual education about American history is all about. And it repeats some of those worn-out excuses that we hear from those who decry factual education about American history as divisive and leading us down the road to ruin.
Tony, I wanted to, in my closing statement, I wanted to touch on something you had mentioned about everyone being equally sinful and fallen, which I completely agree with. We all have the potential to do great evil. But here's what I'm concerned about, and that is I'm more concerned about power. In other words, it isn't just that people do evil, but people who have power tend to use their power in ways that have greater impacts on society. And I think that that's what critical race theory is really trying to do, is saying the people who have power are the people who make the laws, judge the laws, evaluate the laws, who teach, all of that. And I understand critical race theory is just a way to say, how can we critique this use of power and ask whether it is delivering on the goal of equity in our society for all people?
Sure. That's fair. That's fair, and I appreciate the comments. I find myself asking myself over and over again, how did CRT become the poster child for racial reconciliation in the country? And I think it's if you are in the camp that says CRT is broken, a broken clock is right twice a day. So there's some truth that you can find. But then the other extreme, if everything is racist, nothing is racist. I think we need to teach our kids, history. I just, if I hear and I see any group of kids being marginalized or making, feeling as though they are sinful because of the sins of their parents, I just reject that, wholeheartedly. And there's reports on news stations, there's articles, a plethora of them out there where this is taking place. And as Tom said, you can't, judge all the teachers, but if we have teachers doing that, I think they should be repotted.
So I think the paradox is, how do we transcend issues of racial inequality without talking about race?
Yeah.
And however, then he says, well, if all we focus on is race, how are we ever going to transcend conversations about race? And I think figuring out how we do that is what makes this issue so sticky, and why I reject the idea of state legislatures saying you can talk about this, but you can't talk about this, because I think that it's open discourse that generally leads us to a better appreciation of our truths. I think that what the purpose of law is supposed to achieve is greater equity, and the purpose of schooling is to help children to discover the best expression of their most authentic selves. And if we can figure out how to have the conversations, the open conversations, and trust children to be resilient, we will get to where we need to be.
Well, great. Thank you. What an excellent conversation today. I've been sitting here listening as an educator and thinking how complex it is to have conversations in our schools that focus on truth and building up our community without having difficult conversations. Well, of course, we can't. As soon as you have difficult conversations, as soon as you face the realities that there has been racism, there is racism, and the same with other topics, then we're not educating. So I thank you for bringing this topic to life. And thank you to viewers for joining us. Please continue to join us. Send us your messages, send us your ideas. We always are very pleased to hear from you. The Charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America, we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but in reality. And now, friends, until next week at the same time and over the very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. And may the God of all of us bless all of you.